There are days when everything feels strangely quiet. The sun isn't too harsh, the wind isn't too strong, yet something deep inside an old man's chest begins to stir like a silent bell ringing from within. From a distance, a wild horse comes galloping through the dust, its hooves pounding the ground, its eyes wide with panic as if trying to scream something that no voice could ever say. It pulls him away from his old shed, guiding him to a place he never expected to go. A place where a lion lies collapsed in the tall grass, drained and motionless. And what that lion did next didn't just save the old man's life. It opened a journey so powerful, even nature itself had to bow to gratitude. Dry season in the savannah. The wind brings no relief, only stirs up red dust and deepens the cracks in the earth. A small wooden shack sits quietly on the edge of the reserve, as if time itself had forgotten it. Inside lives Eli, a man in his 60s alone, repeating the same days with a pot of cold tea and a worn notebook on wild animal behavior. No one asked him anything. No one needed him anymore. He used to be the path keeper, tracking every footprint in the forest. Now he only keeps memories. But memories can't keep you warm. One early morning, amid the rustling wind, he heard a faint whinny coming from the tall grass. When he got there, Eli found a foal panting lying beside its mother's body, dead from a steel trap. Her leg, broken blood, dried deep into the dirt. The foal wasn't injured, but it lay collapsed, terrified, exhausted. Eli said nothing. He simply wiped its face with a cloth and poured a few drops of water into its parched mouth. Could nature ever forgive a human hand that once severed so many threads of life here? He brought the foal back to the shack, built a makeshift pen from scrap wood. Each morning, he washed its legs, cooked porridge, dropped saline into its eyes. He didn't give it a name, just called it Little One. But deep down, he knew this creature was filling a space inside him that had long stood hollow. He had cared for many wild animals before, but never one that made him mindful even of the sound of his own voice. Then one day the foal broke out of the pen and vanished. Eli thought it had chosen the wild. But that evening, as he was lighting the stove, it came back, standing under the shade of a tree, silently gazing into the shack. From that day on, it didn't need a pen. Each morning, it would appear walking beside him, through every grass-lined path, as if it had never left his side. In a world full of blood and instinct, why would a wild animal choose to stay with a man? Eli named it Ciro Red Dust, for the color of its mane and the warmth in its eyes like the earth after rain. No one taught it, but it knew to stand still when Eli paused to listen to the forest. It wasn't wild, it wasn't tame, it was part of him. He saved it from death. But it was Ciro who quietly saved him from the slow decay of loneliness. The savannah afternoon was windless. Only the faint hum of insects filled the air, mingled with dry heat and the smell of earth like ash. Eli sat beneath the shack's awning, his eyes following a distant flight of hornbills, his hand scribbling a few scattered lines. Nothing moved, nothing made a sound. The whole world seemed to be holding its breath. And when the savannah holds its breath like this, it's not peace, it's a warning. Suddenly hoofbeats, thunderous and fast. Ciro appeared in the distance, galloping straight toward the shack like a storm of dust. It neighed non-stop, eyes-wide hooves pounding the earth, as if calling someone back to life. Skidding to a halt at the porch, it tossed its head, stomped the ground, nervous to the point of desperation. Once a silent shadow of a horse, today it had become a storm knocking on the doors of Eli's soul. Eli jumped to his feet. He stepped closer, and for the first time, Ciro didn't back away. It pressed its head into his hand, then turned, ran a few steps, looked back, eyes pleading. No words were needed. Eli understood. Something out there needed him. Was it danger, a wounded animal, or something that still had a chance to be saved? No hesitation. Eli stuffed a medical kit into his backpack, grabbed a canteen of water. No radio, no clearance. He trusted his instincts, the same ones that had once kept him alive on the battlefield. And now they were speaking again. For the first time in years, he climbed onto a horse's back. Ciro took off hooves, flattening the grass wind, lashing his face, the setting sun bleeding red behind them, like an open wound refusing to close. No one had ever taught Eli how to read a horse, but he understood, because he had once run like that too when his last comrade fell in the deserts of Afghanistan. They galloped through the dust-choked savannah. Eli didn't know where Ciro was taking him, but he didn't ask. Because some journeys don't begin with a destination, they begin with a look you simply can't turn away from. Ciro couldn't speak, but in its eyes something was screaming that Eli could not ignore. After nearly an hour riding through the savannah, Ciro suddenly stopped beside a low bush. It breathed heavily, then fixed its gaze deep into the tangled leaves. Eli dismounted, bent down, and parted the branches, and his heart clenched. What he saw wasn't just a creature, it was the collapse of a symbol. Lying in the tall grass was a young male lion, once strong and proud, now sunken and still. Its hind leg caught tight in a steel trap, blackened blood crusted thick flies, swarming. Its breath was faint, eyes dim like cooled ash, not fierce but filled with something closer to shame for not being able to stand. A lion that no longer roars is a soul falling from its own throne. Eli froze. His every instinct told him to step back, but Ciro didn't flinch. The horse took one more step forward, then stood still. Maybe it remembered what it felt like to be left in pain. Maybe it remembered the first gaze that had pulled it back from the edge. Did Ciro see itself in the dying creature before them, or was it Eli who saw some old piece of himself lying there in the grass? Eli hesitated, then opened his medical kit. His hands trembled not from fear, but from the weight of choosing compassion over survival instinct. He moved forward, each step measured and slow. The lion didn't stir, didn't growl. It just watched him with eyes deep as a dry well. Between the two beings, one man, one predator, there was no language, but there was something else understanding that rose above instinct. Eli knelt, examined the wound, and inside him something softened, not fear, but mercy. Behind him, Ciro stood quietly, not clear if it was guarding the moment or witnessing something extraordinary, kindness, returning. Eli had never imagined that this time it would be the horse showing him that kindness isn't instinct, it's a choice. Eli set up a makeshift tarp to block the sun, cleared the area around the tall grass. He boiled water, cleaned the lion's wound, and cut away the necrotic flesh. His hands shook from exhaustion and heat, not fear. The lion remained motionless, breathing faintly, eyes half closed, as if life had stepped away, but the soul refused to leave. Eli was doing something against nature, kneeling before a creature that once made the world itself retreat. He chewed dried meat, mixed it into a thin broth, and fed it spoon by spoon into the lion's mouth. It coughed its body, jolting slightly, but it didn't resist. As evening fell, Eli wiped its face with a warm cloth. The lion's eyes opened, slightly, glanced across Eli's weathered face, not with aggression, but as if wondering whether this would be the last time it ever saw someone. That gaze wasn't a predator's. It belonged to a being that had forgotten how to survive, but wasn't ready to go. That night, beside a small fire, Eli watched the lion sleep, its breathing heavy and labored. He whispered a name, Ash. Not because he thought of death, but because ashes only exist when something once burned. Ciro lay nearby, calm and still. Eli glanced at them both, feeling as if he wasn't just holding on to a life, but to a flicker of flame still barely burning within himself. When you name a wild creature, it means you no longer see it as beast. It's become part of something you're not yet ready to lose. Ash stirred in his sleep. Eli placed a hand close, not touching, just near enough to feel the faint warmth of a body still battling for life. He thought he was saving an animal, but maybe he was holding on to a piece of his own heart that had burned out long ago. Eli didn't leave Ash's side for 7 nights. He built a temporary shelter nearby, kept the fire burning through the dark, warm water and medicine always within reach, as if guarding a fragile breath. Ash remained still, his breathing raspy, his body curled in tight, as if trying to hold on to whatever was left of life. Eli stayed awake not out of fear of losing him, but of returning to the silence that had followed him for years. Because every time he saw Ash struggle to breathe, he saw a younger version of himself, fighting to stay alive only because someone had chosen to sit beside him. He didn't know when it started, but soon he found himself talking to Ash. Sometimes about the war, sometimes about his late wife, how she used to soak her hands in cold tea every morning. No one ever answered, but Ash never looked away. His ears twitched whenever Eli spoke, even when it was just a broken melody from an old guitar tied with rope strummed into the night on the 4th day. A creature doesn't have to understand you to stay. It just needs to feel that your breath is still with it. On the 3rd day, Ash managed to stretch out a paw. On the 4th, he drank water from Eli's hand. By the 6th, his eyes had cleared, no longer dull, but quietly searching, as if asking a question he didn't yet know how to name. On the 7th night, as Eli was tending the fire, he heard a faint rustle behind him. Ash was standing, unsteady, his shoulders still bandaged, but his trembling legs had found the ground. Zero lifted his head, no whinny, just a silent gaze. Ash turned to Eli. He didn't roar, just let out a soft, brief rumble like wind brushing past a hollow throat. A lion doesn't need to roar to prove its strength. But when it chooses to roar as a farewell, it means you were worthy of its goodbye. Ash turned away, walking into the thick grass shadows. No glance back, no need. Eli stayed there by the fading firelight, his chest heavy with something he hadn't yet found the words to name and maybe never needed to. Late afternoon, Eli followed a trail of fresh elephant dung leading into the low grasslands. On the cracked earth, he spotted rusted bullet casings, scattered wire boot prints tangled with antelope tracks. It wasn't the first time he'd come across traps, but this time something chilled his spine, as if he, not the animals, was the one being hunted. Eli had once faced guns and warfare, but now even nature itself seemed to tremble before the weapons hiding in the grass. As he rounded a mound of dirt, 3 figures burst from the scrub, as if they'd grown out of the earth. One kicked Eli backward, slamming him to the ground, pressing a gun into his chest. Another tore open his backpack, flipping through his field notes. The third hissed, "You spying on us, old man." Eli said nothing. His eyes locked onto a page that had fluttered free, a sketch of Ash lying beneath the bush, with Zero standing guard, like a bronze statue. He wasn't afraid of dying. What he feared was that the things that had once saved him might never get the chance to live. The leader snarled, "Tell us, where do you usually see elephants, lions? Or do you want your grave right here?" Eli's chin hit the dirt. His lips bled, but his gaze did not drop. The sound of a gun chambering rang out cold and final, like a verdict passed on a world that once believed nature had its own laws. Poachers shoot for profit, but greed knows no boundaries. Then a piercing whinny broke the air, sharp, frantic. Zero. Charging from afar, his hooves tearing through dust, his eyes blazing with fire. No longer the gentle shadow of a horse, but a living siren sounding the alarm with every beat of life. Zero had always stood behind Eli, but now that Eli had fallen, he no longer stood still. One of the men raised his gun toward the horse, but the grass behind them erupted as if the earth itself exhaled in fury. A roar exploded through the clearing, deep and thunderous like stone cracking under heaven's weight. Ash. He leapt from the shadows, claws slicing through the air like axes. The same body Eli once touched like a dying ember was now burning like wildfire. As the world revealed its darkest face, Nature revealed its brightest to answer in kind. Ash hadn't come back for gratitude. He came back because Eli had once placed something inside him, a chance to survive, called trust. Ash charged in like a roaring storm, shattering the frozen silence of the sun-scorched savannah. His first strike hit the leader dead on the lion's body, slammed into him with such force it lifted him off the ground. The sound of claws ripping through his back was sharp, chilling, tearing fabric, flesh, and pride. The man collapsed, motionless. One of the others panicked, fired. The bullet hissed through the air and buried itself in Ash's left shoulder. The whole plain seemed to hold its breath. Ash staggered. Blood sprayed in a dark arc across his sunburned golden coat, but he didn't retreat, didn't roar, didn't dodge. Ash didn't dodge, didn't retreat. He didn't come to survive, he came so someone else wouldn't have to die. And like lightning chasing thunder, he lunged again, knocking the gun from the last man's hand. That man screamed, turned, and ran, tripping, then vanishing into the grass, leaving behind weapons and shattered arrogance. In the blazing red dust, Ash stood still. He didn't chase, didn't hunt, just stood there, his body heaving, blood soaking his shoulder. Eli slowly pushed himself upright. His knees scraped, his lips cracked and bleeding, but it wasn't his wounds that made his heart ache. It was that bleeding figure standing like a living wall between him and death. Ash didn't roar anymore, didn't threaten. He just stood a breathing wall. Eli crawled toward him, his hands muddy and bloodied, reaching for the lion's neck. His hands trembled not from fear, but because he had never touched something so wild that trusted him this much. His fingers found the coarse fur hot and wet with blood. Ash didn't move. He let Eli touch him as if he understood that the touch wasn't to check a wound, but simply because Eli needed to. The silence between two beings who were never meant to belong together was at that moment complete harmony. No one spoke. Eli didn't ask, "Why did you come back?" And Ash didn't need to answer. That question had already dissolved into this moment where no gunfire remained, only the sound of heartbeats. Zero stood nearby. He didn't step forward, but he didn't leave either. His eyes softened from terror to something like reverence. The three of them, man, horse, lion, stood still like statues, and in that moment the wild world had no lines, no predators, no prey, only souls that had once been saved now returning to save each other. This was no longer a story of man saving beast. It was a moment where three species bowed their heads to something greater than survival. Ash bowed his head, not from weakness, but as a gentle nod. A thank you. Or maybe a final hello. Then he turned, limping toward the tall grass, each step slow but steady, melting into the sunset like glowing embers, catching fire one last time. Eli didn't call after him. He knew some souls you can't hold on to, but they will always return when the time comes. You can save a creature, but only when it comes back to save you will you truly understand kindness is the one language that needs no words. At dawn, with mist still hanging thin over the grass, Eli woke earlier than usual. He poured tea into an old ceramic cup, stepped onto the porch, his eyes fixed on the patch of sunlit grass, the place where Ash once emerged, like a memory both broken and whole. But this morning, and many mornings before, there were no lion prints left on the damp earth. Was this silence emptiness, or nature's way of saying that's enough? The air wasn't sad, just still, as if every sound had bowed its head to preserve something sacred. Zero still came every morning just as he had when Ash lay among the grass. But now he didn't neigh or run circles. He simply stood a short distance away, close enough for Eli to know he was there, but never intruding on the space he understood could never be filled. Zero knew Ash wasn't coming back, and Eli knew too. But between those two creatures there was no need to name it. Eli didn't ask why, didn't search, didn't look toward the grass for too long. He simply quietly took down the tarp he once raised to shade Ash, folding it with care, as if putting away a chapter that could never be written twice. Ash hadn't disappeared. He had simply returned to the wild he was born to belong to. And Eli understood that with the kind of acceptance only those who've lost can ever truly grasp. Not every parting is a loss. Some are nature's way of teaching us how to let go, without breaking. Each morning, he sat with his back against the shack wall, eyes half closed, fingers lightly resting on his cup of tea. A soft breeze would pass and the grass would sway, as if someone had brushed against memories that needed no words. Ash was no longer there. But Eli didn't feel alone. He didn't retell the story, didn't say the name, didn't write another word in the notebook. But every time the wind whispered through the cracks in the shack, his heart would skip, not from longing, but from knowing what's real. Never fully leaves. A creature may go, but a bond, if deep enough, will remain beneath the skin unseen. Eli didn't hope for Ash to return, but each time the wind swept through the grass, he'd tilt his head slightly, as if listening for something invisible. Early morning. A light rain swept across the savannah's edge, leaving behind the smell of fresh soil and droplets clinging to the lavender leaves that Eli was gently pruning. He was just about to head inside when his computer chimed a rare sound on such windless days. The subject line was simple: update from Masai Mara Reserve. Eli opened the email, and within the first few lines, his heart paused. Not all answers come when we ask for them, but some arrive at the exact moment we least expect. The letter spoke of a male lion appearing regularly at the edge of Masai Mara Reserve. He didn't hunt, didn't cause alarm. He moved silently, patrolling areas where traps were often set. A week ago, he saved a young elephant from a steel snare, then slipped away, never touching the vulnerable calf. They called him the Guardian Flame. A lion that refuses to harm a helpless calf, that's not instinct. That's something planted long ago. The conservation team fitted a tracking device. When they scanned it, they discovered under the lion's matted neck fur an old faded microchip from a model no longer in production. No one at the organization knew who had placed that chip, but Eli knew. How do you know when a creature still carries your imprint, when it saves the very life you once swore to protect? At the bottom of the email was a photograph. A lion walking across red earth, a long scar on his left shoulder, a stride full of purpose, eyes that looked forward not like a hunter, but like a sentinel who knew exactly what he was guarding. Eli stared at the image. His hand rested on the mouse but didn't move. His eyes blurred with time, but in his heart, everything had never been clearer. Ash wasn't just the animal he once saved. Ash had become something more, nature's answer to a question Eli had once whispered into silence. Life isn't just survival. It's continuing a journey that someone once began with trembling hands. Inside a weather-worn wooden cabin, Eli sat at an old desk. In front of him lay a thick notebook leather cover, scratched page edges yellowed with time. He wrote slowly, not to publish, not for any editor, but to preserve each scattered memory. The way Ciro first stood in front of him. The clouded look in Ash's eyes the first time they opened in the grass. The roar, not a warning, but a farewell. Some stories aren't written to be told, but to be remembered. Each morning, Eli still brewed tea, still sat on the porch, facing the sunburnt plains. He didn't wait anymore, but he also no longer felt empty. Nature hadn't changed. But in the rustling wind, in the golden light brushing through the grass, he felt something present quietly, without needing to appear. You can't relive a moment, but if you truly lived it, it will live on inside you. Once a young student asked him, after all these years as a ranger, what's the most important thing you've learned? Eli just smiled, his voice rough but steady. If you've ever lived with kindness, sometimes nature will come back. Look at you and protect the things you haven't yet finished. Not every life leaves footprints, but some leave a gaze that nature never forgets. You can't keep a lion or a forest. But if you've ever lived with kindness sometimes, you'll see them turn around and look back.